My name is Victor Caldwell, and I need to tell you about what happened to my family last fall in Yellowstone. I've been a hunting guide here for the past 5 years, ever since I quit my ranger job. You might think you know Yellowstone, the geysers, the bears, the tourists with their cameras. But there's something else out there. Something that wears familiar faces and steals more than just your appearance. It started when my wife Ruth, our 8-year-old son Daniel, and I decided to take one last camping trip in our old Dodge RV before the winter closed in. Ruth loves taking wildlife photos, and Daniel, well, he's always been special. He sees things others don't. We used to think he had a wild imagination, but now I know better. I really wish we hadn't ignored his warnings. The RV was our pride and joy, deep burgundy with silver trim. I had fixed it up myself, added hidden compartments for my hunting gear, and installed a wood-burning stove for those cold mountain nights. Ruth called it our cozy cabin on wheels. If only we knew it would become our last defense against something straight out of our worst nightmares. That first morning, when we pulled into the backcountry area, everything seemed perfect. The first snow had just dusted the ground, making the whole world look clean and new. Daniel was excited to use his new colored pencils to draw the mountains, and Ruth was already planning her photo spots. But then Daniel looked into the RV's side mirror and went quiet. "Daddy," he said, his voice shaking, "why are there shadow people watching us?" I should have listened. I should have turned that RV around right then and there. But how could I have known? How could anyone have known what was waiting for us in those beautiful, cursed woods? We parked our RV near an old trail I remembered from my ranger days. The snow was getting heavier, and the wind made strange whistling sounds through the trees. Ruth was setting up her camera gear when Daniel tugged at my jacket. "Dad, my drawings keep changing," he whispered, showing me his sketchbook. He had drawn our family, but something was off. The faces in his pictures were blurry, like someone had smudged them with their thumb. I told him it was just the cold making his hands shake, but deep down, something felt wrong. That evening, we found an old ranger station. The weird thing was, there was a coffee pot on the stove, still warm, steam rising from it, but no one was there. All the chairs were pushed back from the table like people had left in a hurry. Ruth took some photos of the station, saying something didn't feel right about the place. "Look at this, Victor." She called me over to her camera screen. She had taken pictures of the thermal pools nearby, and in the steam, I could see what looked like people standing there. But when we looked up, nobody was around, just empty space. Then Daniel started crying. He pointed to the station's window, and I saw what scared him. There were handprints on the glass, but they were sliding down slowly, like someone was dragging their fingers through fog on the other side. But there was no fog, and no one was there. I'm a practical man. I've dealt with bears, wolves, and all sorts of dangerous situations in my years as a ranger, but nothing in my training prepared me for what we found next. Behind the station, arranged in neat rows like some sick display, were animal skins. Not just random kills, they were laid out in groups, like families. A big deer skin, a smaller one, and a tiny one all together. That's when I heard Ruth scream from inside our RV. When I ran back, she was staring at our family photos on the wall. The faces in them were different, but somehow still looked like us. Just wrong. I grabbed my rifle from its hidden compartment, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure what I was protecting my family from. As night fell, we huddled in our RV, listening to the wind. But it wasn't just wind anymore. It sounded like voices whispering our names. That night in the RV was the longest of my life. None of us could sleep. Daniel kept drawing in his book, his small hands shaking. "They're learning us, Dad," he said, showing me pictures of people with twisted faces. "They're watching how we move." Around midnight, we heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside. They circled our RV slowly, like someone taking their time. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window. The snow was covered in wolf tracks, but they were huge, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen in my 15 years in Yellowstone. And they were walking in perfect circles, like humans would. Then came the knocking. 3 park rangers stood outside our door, wearing the same uniform I used to wear. But something was off about them. Ruth noticed it first. When they moved past our exterior lights, they didn't cast any shadows. "We're here to help," one of them said. His voice sounded like he was copying someone else's words. "There's a storm coming. You need to come with us." Daniel grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Daddy, those aren't rangers," he whispered. "Their faces are empty behind their faces." I looked closer through the window. The ranger speaking had my old badge number on his shirt, the same badge I'd turned in 5 years ago. The same badge I'd seen earlier that day on one of the corpses hidden behind the ranger station. Ruth's camera started clicking automatically. When we looked at the pictures later, they showed something horrible. The rangers' uniforms were filled with nothing. Just empty clothes standing up by themselves. Inside our RV, things started moving on their own. The cups in the cupboard rearranged themselves. Our family photos kept changing, sometimes showing us, sometimes showing strangers wearing our smiles. The worst part was when I found my old ranger notebooks in a drawer I knew was empty before. "They're not trying to hurt us," Daniel said, still drawing frantically. "They're trying to become us." I knew we had to get out of there, but the RV wouldn't start. The fake rangers kept getting closer to our door, their movements jerky, like they were practicing how to walk like humans. Ruth held Daniel close while I tried everything I could think of to get the engine running. That's when Daniel pointed to something through the back window. "Look at the ground," he whispered. The snow was melting in a perfect circle around our RV, revealing a dark hole underneath. Our RV was slowly sinking. We grabbed only what we could carry, my rifle, Ruth's camera, and Daniel's drawings. As we climbed out the emergency window, I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the trees around us, there were families, dozens of them, all standing perfectly still, all wearing the same clothes, but with faces that seemed to shift and change in the darkness. "They're not real people," Daniel said, clutching his sketchbook. "They're wearing memories like clothes." We ran toward the ranger station. It was the only shelter we could think of. Inside, Ruth's camera kept taking pictures on its own, and each flash showed something different. In one photo, the room was normal. In the next, it was filled with ancient tribal items, bones, and strange symbols on the walls. Then we found the basement door. It was hidden under an old rug, and warm air was coming up from below. I knew we shouldn't go down there, but we could hear those things getting closer outside. Their footsteps didn't sound human anymore. "We have to," Ruth said, holding up her camera. "Look." The last photo she took showed something impossible. An underground cave filled with RVs, dozens of them, from different decades. All of them belonged to families who had gone missing in Yellowstone. Daniel grabbed my hand. "Dad, I can see the real them now. They're studying us, learning us. They pick families because..." Before he could finish, the fake rangers burst through the door above us. But now, they weren't even trying to look human anymore. We ran down into the cave, our flashlights bouncing off the walls. The cave was huge, like a giant underground parking lot, filled with RVs of all kinds. Some looked ancient, covered in dust and rust. Each one had a family's name scratched into its side. "They're not just copying us," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "They're collecting us." In one corner, we found a wall covered in old photos. Every picture showed a family, smiling, happy, but as my flashlight moved across them, the faces in the photos changed. It was like watching hundreds of families slowly turn into something else. Ruth's camera kept flashing, and each picture showed something worse. Empty clothes walking by themselves, shadows with too many arms. And worst of all, creatures that looked almost human, but wrong, like someone trying to draw a person without ever seeing one. Then Daniel started drawing faster than I'd ever seen. "They're coming," he said. "But my drawings, they hurt them. They can't copy what I draw." He was right. When the creatures came down the stairs, they moved like broken puppets. But whenever they got near Daniel's drawings, they seemed to glitch, like a television with bad reception. Ruth discovered something too. When she took photos of them, some of the creatures got trapped in the pictures. They screamed, not like humans or animals, but like the wind through old trees. I remembered something from my ranger days. An old medicine man had given me some sacred herbs, saying they'd keep the hollow ones away. I'd kept them in my jacket all these years, thinking it was just a nice gesture. Now I understood. We need to split up, I told Ruth and Daniel. They can't copy all of us at once. It confuses them. Ruth looked at me with tears in her eyes. She knew what I was planning. Victor, no. The creatures were getting closer. Some looked like rangers, some like tourists, some like my own family. But all of them were wrong, like someone had made a mistake while putting a human together. I told Ruth to take Daniel and run to the far side of the cave. I had a plan, but I knew it would cost me everything. While they ran, I pulled out the sacred herbs and my old lighter. The creatures were everywhere now, some crawling on the ceiling like spiders, others walking sideways on the walls. They all wanted the same thing, to learn how to be us, to steal our lives. "Hey!" I shouted, getting their attention. "You want to know who I am? Come and get my memories." They all turned toward me at once. It was horrible. Some had my face, some had Ruth's, some looked like Daniel, but none of them got it quite right. Like looking in a broken mirror. I threw the herbs into an old oil drum and set them on fire. The smoke was thick and green, filling the cave. The creatures started screaming, but now they were screaming with my voice, with Ruth's voice, with Daniel's voice. Daniel's drawings began to glow in the smoke. Each picture he'd made started moving, and I could see people, real people, climbing out of them. They were the souls of everyone these things had stolen over the years. Ruth's camera flashed one last time, and I saw my own face starting to fade in the photo. I knew what was happening. The herbs weren't just hurting the creatures, they were poisoning all memories, including mine. "Run!" I shouted to Ruth and Daniel. "I love you both, but after today, you need to be someone else, someone new. They'll keep looking for the Caldwells forever." The last thing I remember seeing was Daniel's tears as Ruth pulled him away. My memories were dissolving like sugar in rain, taking everything I was with them. But it worked. The creatures couldn't copy what wasn't there anymore. I know I had a family once. I know I saved them. But I don't remember their faces now. Sometimes, I see a woman taking pictures in the park, or a boy drawing in a notebook, and I feel something. But it's gone before I can grab it. Ruth and Daniel made it out of the cave that night. They ran through the snow until they found a highway. The police found them, cold but alive, but they couldn't tell anyone their real names anymore. They had to become new people with new stories. Today, somewhere in America, there's a young artist whose drawings sometimes move when no one's looking. His mom takes pictures that sometimes show things that shouldn't be there. They live quietly, always moving, never staying in one place too long. Our old RV is still there in Yellowstone, sunk halfway into the ground. The park rangers put up warning signs around it, saying it's just an unstable area. But the truth is in Daniel's drawings, which he left scattered through the park as warnings, and in Ruth's photos, locked away in a government office somewhere, showing things that shouldn't exist. Sometimes, on cold nights when the snow falls, visitors to Yellowstone say they see a man in an old ranger uniform walking the trails. He doesn't remember who he is, but he's still protecting people from the things that steal faces. That's me, or what's left of me. The skinwalkers are still out there, still hunting families, but they're afraid now, afraid of cameras that can trap them, afraid of children who can see their true forms, afraid of drawings that can set their victims free. If you ever visit Yellowstone and see a ranger who doesn't cast a shadow, or meet a family that moves in a way that's not quite right, just remember my story. Remember that some creatures want more than just your life. They want to become you. And if you see a boy somewhere, drawing pictures that seem to move when you blink, or a woman taking photos of things that shouldn't be there, don't say their names. They're safe as long as they stay forgotten. As for me, I'm still here in the park, walking my endless patrol. I may have lost my memories, but I saved the two things that mattered most, even if I can't remember their faces anymore. My name is Robert Daltrey, but everyone calls me Bob. I've been a forest ranger here in the boundary waters of northern Minnesota for almost 15 years now. These days, though, the forest feels different. Lonelier, I guess. Just like my life since Sarah left and took Tommy with her. I still remember that weekend in late autumn of '79 like it was yesterday. It was supposed to be a simple father-son camping trip, my first real time with Tommy since the divorce. He was 12 then, at that awkward age where kids start pulling away from their parents. But I thought maybe, just maybe, a weekend in my old '76 Winnebago would help us reconnect. That olive green RV with its brown stripes wasn't much to look at, but it was home. Sure, it had this funny creaking sound in the bedroom area that used to make Tommy giggle when he was little, back when things were good. Now he just sits there, staring out the window as we drive deeper into the wilderness, his headphones firmly in place. The silence between us is louder than the engine's rumble. The first snowflakes started falling as we turned onto the dirt road leading to the campground. I remember thinking how beautiful it looked, those white specks dancing in my headlights. If only I'd known then what that snow would bring with it. The radio crackled with static as we lost signal. Normal for these parts, but somehow that day, it felt different. "We're almost there, kiddo," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Tommy just nodded, not even bothering to take off his headphones. The temperature gauge on the dashboard showed it was dropping faster than usual, but I didn't think much of it then. That was my first mistake. As we pulled into the empty campground, the snow was coming down harder. The tall white pines swayed in the wind, their branches scratching against each other like whispering voices. I parked the RV in my favorite spot, the one with a view of the lake, though you could barely see it through the thickening snow. "Home sweet home for the weekend," I said, killing the engine. That's when we heard it, a long, low sound, somewhere between a howl and a whisper, echoing through the trees. Tommy finally took off his headphones. "What was that, Dad?" It was the first time he'd spoken to me in hours. I wish I could say I had a good answer for him. I wish I could say I knew what we were about to face in those woods. But all I said was, "Probably just the wind, son. Just the wind." I didn't know then that this would be the beginning of the most terrifying weekend of our lives. I didn't know that some of the local legends about these woods, the ones I'd laughed off for years, were about to prove themselves terrifyingly real. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs. The way the animals had gone quiet, the strange marks on the trees, the unnatural cold that seemed to seep into your bones. But hindsight's always clearer, isn't it? And by the time we figured it out, it was already too late. We were about to learn why the Algonquin elders warned their children never to go into these woods when the first snow falls. We were about to learn why they whispered stories about the Wendigo, the ancient spirit that hunts in the cold and feeds on more than just flesh. But let me tell you exactly how it all happened. As we settled into the RV for the evening, Tommy finally put his headphones away and started unpacking his sleeping bag. I was heating up some soup on our little stove when we heard a knock on the door. Not the usual kind of knock. This was more like someone tapping with long fingernails. "Must be the wind hitting those pine branches," I said. But Tommy's face told me he wasn't buying it. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. There stood old Joe Peterson, his white beard covered in snowflakes. He was the kind of local everyone knew but nobody really knew, if you get what I mean. His eyes were wide, and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. "You folks need to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "First snow came early this year. It's not safe." I tried to laugh it off. "Come on, Joe, we just got here. Have some soup with us?" He shook his head so hard his beard scattered snowflakes everywhere. "You don't understand, Bob. The hunger's waking up. I've seen the signs, the claw marks, the twisted trees. It's hunting again." Tommy came up behind me. "What's hunting, Mr. Peterson?" Joe looked at Tommy like he was seeing a ghost. "Your boy. How old is he?" 12, I said. Joe's face went pale. "It likes them young," he whispered. "Especially the ones carrying pain. I can see it in his eyes, same as the others." The temperature seemed to drop even more. The RV's heater was running full blast, but I could see our breath in the air. "Listen to me," Joe said, grabbing my arm. His hand was ice cold. "If you hear voices calling in the night, any voices, don't answer. If you see lights in the woods, don't follow them. And whatever you do, don't let your boy out of your sight." Before I could ask what he meant, a sound cut through the darkness, like a mix between a wolf's howl and a woman crying. Joe's head snapped toward the sound, and without another word, he disappeared into the snowy darkness. Tommy pressed against my side, something he hadn't done since he was little. "Dad, what was that about?" I closed the door and locked it tight. "Just old Joe being old Joe," I said, trying to sound normal. "He likes to scare tourists with his stories." But as we sat eating our soup, neither of us mentioned the scratching sounds we could hear on the RV's roof, or how the temperature kept dropping even though the heater was running. And we definitely didn't talk about how the shadows outside the windows seemed to be moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. That's when the radio, which had been nothing but static since we arrived, suddenly crackled to life. Through the white noise, we heard something that made my blood run cold. It was Sarah's voice, Tommy's mom, calling for help. But Sarah was hundreds of miles away in Minneapolis. There was no way. Tommy looked at me, his spoon frozen halfway to his mouth. "Dad, why is Mom here?" I reached for the radio dial with a shaking hand, and that's when the real nightmare began. I reached for the radio to turn it off, but Sarah's voice kept getting clearer. She was crying, begging for help. Tommy grabbed my arm, his hand trembling. "We have to help her, Dad," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Stop," I said firmly, holding him back. "Think about it, Tommy. Mom's in Minneapolis with your aunt. This isn't right." The voice on the radio changed then. It wasn't just Sarah anymore. It was mixing with other voices, some whispering, some screaming, all of them begging for help. Suddenly, the RV's windows frosted over from the inside. I'd never seen anything like it. The temperature display on our little weather station was dropping fast. 20 degrees. 10. 0. -10. "Dad?" Tommy's voice was small, scared. "I can't feel my fingers." I grabbed his hands. They were ice cold, even though we were inside. That's when we heard it. Heavy footsteps in the snow outside, circling our RV. Whatever it was big. Each step made a crunching sound that was too loud for any normal animal. We huddled together on the small couch, watching our breath form clouds in the freezing air. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. Then came 3 slow knocks that shook the whole RV. Boom, boom, boom. "Tommy," I whispered, "go to the bedroom and lock the door. Don't come out unless I call you." "But Dad." "Now, Tommy." As he ran to the back, I grabbed my flashlight and ranger knife. The knocking came again, harder this time. Through the frosted windows, I could see a tall, dark shape. It was like a shadow, but it seemed to stand on its own. That's when I heard Tommy scream from the bedroom. I ran to him, my heart pounding. The bedroom window was completely covered in ice, but scratched into the frost were words that made my stomach turn. "Hungry, give him to me." The temperature was now -40. Our breath came out in thick white clouds. The RV's metal walls were groaning from the cold, making that old familiar creaking sound, but now it sounded like laughter. Tommy hugged me tight, shivering. "Dad, look!" He pointed at the window. Through a small clear spot in the frost, we could see something moving between the trees. It was tall, taller than any person should be. Its skin looked like ice, and its eyes. Its eyes were empty and black, like holes in the night. But the worst part was its smile, full of sharp, icy teeth. The creature raised one long bony finger and drew something in the air. As it did, the wind outside got stronger, and the snow started swirling around our RV like a tornado. We were trapped, and whatever that thing was, it was just getting started. The whole RV started shaking as the wind howled louder. I held Tommy close, trying to think of a way out. That's when I noticed something strange. Tommy's eyes had a weird, glassy look, like he was in a trance. "So cold," he mumbled. "It's calling me, Dad. Can't you hear it?" His voice sounded different, older somehow. He started speaking words I didn't understand, like some ancient language. I shook him gently, trying to snap him out of it. "Tommy, look at me, son." Outside, the creature pressed its face against our window. The frost spread from where its breath touched the glass. Through the ice, I could see other shapes moving in the darkness, frozen bodies walking like puppets, their faces twisted in fear. That's when I remembered old Joe's journal. He'd given it to me years ago, telling me to read it if things ever got weird in these woods. I'd stuffed it in the RV's glove compartment, thinking he was just being crazy old Joe. "Stay here," I told Tommy, wrapping him in every blanket we had. I rushed to the front, my hands shaking as I dug out the old leather-bound book. The pages were filled with Joe's messy handwriting and drawings. One picture made my heart stop. It showed the same tall, ice-skinned creature we'd seen. Below it was written, "The Wendigo hunts the broken ones, feeds on pain. Children of broken homes taste sweetest." My divorce from Sarah, Tommy's pain. We'd practically served ourselves up on a silver platter. "Dad!" Tommy's scream snapped me back. "It's in my head. Make it stop." The temperature dropped even lower. Ice was creeping up the walls, covering everything. Tommy started walking toward the door, like something was pulling him. "It says it can make the pain go away," he said in that strange voice. "Says it can make us a family again." I grabbed him just as his hand touched the door handle. The metal was so cold it had stuck to his skin. When I pulled him back, he left a layer of skin on the handle. The Wendigo's laugh echoed through the RV. It wasn't just a monster. It knew exactly what we wanted, what hurt us the most. It was using our own pain against us. But as I held my shivering son, watching him fight against whatever was trying to possess him, I realized something. This thing fed on broken families, on guilt and pain. Maybe that was also its weakness. I had an idea, but it was risky, really risky. In the corner of my eye, I spotted my emergency flare gun. Next to it was the RV's propane tank valve. "Tommy," I said, holding his face in my hands, "listen to me. Whatever happens next, remember, I love you, and I'm sorry I wasn't a better dad." The Wendigo's black eyes locked with mine through the window. It knew what I was planning. I grabbed the flare gun with one hand and held Tommy with the other. My voice shook as I spoke to him, but I tried to sound brave. "Tommy, I need you to listen carefully. When I count to 3, run to the back of the RV and get under the bed. Don't come out no matter what you hear. Promise me?" He nodded weakly, fighting whatever force was trying to control him. "Dad, I'm scared." "I know, buddy. I am too." I took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3. As Tommy ran to the back, I threw open the RV door. The cold hit me like a punch to the chest. The Wendigo was right there, its icy body towering above me. Up close, I could see all the faces of its victims frozen inside its transparent skin, including old Joe's. "You want broken families?" I shouted at it. "You feed on our pain? Well, feast on this." I turned the propane valve wide open. The gas started hissing out. The Wendigo tilted its head, curious. It didn't understand what I was doing. These ancient spirits never understood modern things. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for Tommy," I said, my voice getting stronger. "I'm sorry I let my marriage fall apart. But you know what? I'm not broken. We're not broken. We're just human." The creature reached for me with its long, ice-covered fingers. But something was happening. It seemed confused. Every time I admitted my guilt, accepted my failures, it flinched like I was hurting it. "And my son?" I continued, backing away. He's stronger than you think, stronger than me. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound like cracking ice and breaking hearts. It lunged forward just as I raised the flare gun. "Tommy!" I yelled. "I love you, son!" I pulled the trigger. The red flare shot straight into the propane cloud. For a split second, everything went quiet. Then the world exploded. The blast threw me backwards. The last thing I saw was the Wendigo, its ice body cracking, as I fell toward the hot springs behind our campsite. I heard Tommy screaming my name. And then everything went dark. I wish I could tell you what happened in those next few moments, but I can't. The hot springs were deep, and the cold was everywhere. The last thing I remember was the Wendigo's screech as it followed me down, its icy body meeting the warm water. Tommy told me the rest later. He said the explosion lit up the whole forest. The search and rescue team found him huddled under the RV bed, just like I told him to be. 3 of his fingers were black with frostbite. The doctors couldn't save them. They searched for my body for weeks. All they found was my ranger badge, frozen solid in a block of ice. The strange thing was, the ice wouldn't melt, even in direct sunlight. That was 5 years ago. Tommy's 17 now, living with his mom in Minneapolis. But every winter, he comes back to visit the site. The old Winnebago is still there, frozen in place like some kind of warning sign. Nobody's been able to move it. It's like the ground itself is holding on to it. The locals say on cold nights, when the first snow falls, you can hear whistling in the white pines. Tommy says he knows it's me, still watching over the woods, keeping other families safe. They found other bodies too, dozens of them, preserved in ice caves nearby. All of them were from broken families, divorced parents, runaway kids, people carrying deep hurts. The Wendigo had been feeding for years. Tommy doesn't have nightmares anymore. He says facing that thing, seeing how it used our pain against us, helped him understand something. Family isn't about being perfect. It's about love, even when things are broken. Sometimes, when the winter wind blows just right, the trees whisper a warning. Not all hunger is for food, and not all monsters can be seen. But the strongest protection isn't in weapons or walls. It's in facing your pain, accepting it, and loving anyway. As for me, well, nobody knows for sure. But if you're ever up in the Boundary Waters during the first snow and you hear a ranger's whistle in the wind, just remember, some sacrifices are worth making, and a father's love can be stronger than any ancient spirit. Tommy still visits, you know. He leaves a thermos of hot coffee by the frozen RV. Says it's to keep his old man warm during those long winter nights. And sometimes, when he comes back the next day, the coffee is gone. My name is Jackson Wheeler, but everyone calls me Jack. I never thought I'd be telling this story, but what happened in those West Virginia mountains changed my life forever. I'm a coal mine safety inspector, been doing this job for 15 years now. It's not the most exciting work, but it puts food on the table for me and my son, Michael. Michael. He's 14 and smart as a whip. Ever since his mom passed away 3 years ago, it's just been the two of us. He's got this thing for rocks, not just any rocks, but special ones. His room looks like a mini museum with all his collections lined up on shelves. Sometimes I worry he spends too much time alone with his stones, but hey, at least it keeps him out of trouble. We live in this old but reliable 1969 Winnebago Brave RV. It's forest green with beige stripes, and I've modified it quite a bit for my work. Added some heavy-duty suspension, extra oxygen tanks, and all sorts of gear for exploring underground. Michael calls it our mobile command center, which always makes me smile. It was January 2025 when everything started. The weather was brutal, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I got this urgent call about some strange mine collapses in a small town called Hollow Creek. Normally, I wouldn't bring Michael along on job calls, but it was winter break, and I couldn't leave him alone for what might be weeks. Little did I know that this wouldn't be just another inspection job. The lunar eclipse was coming, and the mountains, well, the mountains were hiding something. Something that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. I remember driving down that winding mountain road, snow falling softly outside. Michael was in the passenger seat, nose buried in one of his geology books. That's when we first saw Hollow Creek, a half-abandoned mining town with more boarded-up windows than living souls. If only I'd known then what I know now, maybe I would have turned that RV around and never looked back. But that's not how life works, is it? Sometimes the darkest stories find you, whether you're ready for them or not. As we pulled into Hollow Creek, something felt off right away. The streets were empty except for a few old trucks covered in snow. Most of the houses had broken windows, and the only open store was a small grocery with flickering lights. "Dad, look at this," Michael said, pressing his face against the window. He was pointing at something strange, a bunch of dead birds lying in a perfect circle on the ground. I slowed the RV down, and we both stared. It wasn't natural, the way they were arranged. We parked near the old mining office, and that's when we met Betsy Cooper. She was this older lady, probably in her late 60s, wearing a thick wool coat and carrying a bag full of old books. She was the first person we'd seen since entering town. "You folks shouldn't be here," she said, walking up to our RV. Her voice was shaky but firm, not with the eclipse coming. I explained about the mine inspection job, showing her my ID. Michael, being his curious self, was already out of the RV, picking up some weird-looking rocks from the ground. "Michael, don't!" Betsy called out suddenly, making us both jump. "Don't touch those crystal formations. They're not natural." That's when we heard it, a low humming sound coming from underground. It was so deep you could feel it in your chest more than hear it. Our RV's radio suddenly turned on by itself, making this awful static noise. Michael dropped the rocks, but I noticed his hands were shaking. "Dad," he whispered, "the rocks, they were warm, and I think they were moving." I thought he was imagining things, but then I saw it too. The crystals he dropped were slowly changing color, from clear to a deep purple. And was it just my eyes, or were they actually pulsing, like a heartbeat? Betsy grabbed both our arms. "Come with me," she said urgently. "There's something you need to see, something you need to know about this place." As we followed her toward her small house at the edge of town, I heard a deep rumble from beneath our feet. The ground trembled slightly, and somewhere in the distance, a dog started howling. I looked back at our RV, our only way out of this place, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly afraid. Not the normal kind of fear you get from dangerous mine conditions. This was different. This was the fear of something impossible becoming possible. And it was only the beginning. Betsy's house was small but filled with old maps and newspaper clippings on every wall. She made us hot chocolate while Michael and I sat at her kitchen table. The humming sound was quieter here, but I could still feel it. 30 years ago, Betsy said, pulling out a dusty photo album, we lost 12 miners in a single night. They went down for their usual shift, but they never came back up. She showed us old photos of smiling men in mining gear. The search teams found their equipment, their lunch boxes, but no bodies. Just strange crystal growths where they had been. Michael leaned forward, interested. "Like the crystals outside?" "Exactly like those," Betsy nodded. But that wasn't the end. Every few years, especially during lunar eclipses, people would disappear, always near the mines, always leaving behind those crystals. Suddenly, the lights flickered. We all looked up. The humming got louder. "There's something else," Betsy said, her voice getting quieter. She pulled out an old map of the mine system. The miners, they found something down there before they disappeared. Ancient tunnels, not made by humans, and drawings on the walls. Drawings of things that... She stopped as her hands started shaking. That's when Michael grabbed my arm. "Dad," he whispered. "The rock's in my pocket, they're singing." I watched in shock as he pulled out the crystals he'd picked up earlier. They were glowing now, giving off a soft purple light. But worse than that, they were definitely humming a tune, like a lullaby, but wrong somehow. The lights went out completely. In the darkness, the crystal's glow got brighter, and then we heard it, scratching sounds, coming from inside the walls, not like mice or rats. This was different. This was bigger. "They're awake," Betsy whispered. "The crawlers. They know you're here." The scratching got louder, closer. Michael's crystals were pulsing faster now, like they were excited. I grabbed my son's hand, ready to run. But where could we run? The scratching was everywhere now. And outside, through Betsy's window, I could see our RV starting to sink into what had been solid ground just hours ago. We were trapped, and whatever was in these mountains, whatever had taken those miners, it was coming for us too. The scratching in the walls got louder, and I could hear something moving behind them. Betsy quickly lit some old candles, their light making scary shadows dance on the walls. "We need to get to your RV," Betsy said, grabbing her coat. "It's our only chance. The crawlers, they don't like engine noise or gasoline smell." Just then, we heard a horrible cracking sound. The wall near Michael started to break open, but not like normal. It was like the wall was melting, turning into those strange crystals. And through the crystals, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A long white hand with fingers too many and too long reached through. Its skin looked like paper, but moved like rubber. Michael screamed, and I pulled him back. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Michael's hand. We ran for the front door, Betsy right behind us. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, but something was wrong with it. The snowflakes were glowing purple where they touched those crystals on the ground. Our RV was halfway sunk into the ground, tilted to one side. I could hear the metal groaning as the earth tried to swallow it. "Dad, look!" Michael pointed at the ground. All around us, the snow was melting in circles, like something was moving underneath. The humming was so loud now it made my teeth hurt. We ran to the RV, slipping on the icy ground. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Behind us, I could hear something coming out of Betsy's house. Something that shouldn't exist. "They're coming up," Betsy shouted. "The eclipse is starting." She was right. The moon was starting to go dark, and as it did, the ground began to crack open. Not like an earthquake, more like something was pushing up from below. I finally got the RV door open and pushed Michael inside. But when I turned to help Betsy, I saw them. Coming out of the ground like swimmers breaking through water, except they were coming through solid rock. The crawlers. Pale white, long and twisted, with faces that looked almost human, but wrong. Their eyes glowed the same purple as the crystals, and when they moved, the ground moved with them. We needed to get out of there. But how could we escape when the ground itself was against us? I jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key. The RV's engine roared to life, but the wheels just spun in place. We were sinking deeper. "The emergency winch," I remembered. "Michael, get the controls." Michael grabbed a winch control box while I ran outside to hook the cable to a thick old tree. The snow was falling sideways now, and the moon was almost completely dark. The crawlers were getting closer, moving through the ground like it was water. "Betsy, get in!" I shouted, but she shook her head. "No time. I'll hold them off." She pulled something from her coat. It looked like old mining flares. "They hate bright light. Go." I didn't want to leave her, but I had to save Michael. Just as I got back in the RV, Michael hit the winch button. The cable went tight, and slowly, our RV started pulling free from the ground. But then we heard it, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming. Crystal spikes were growing up from the ground, trying to trap our wheels. The RV's metal sides groaned as crystals started growing on them too. "Dad!" Michael's voice was strange, different. "The crystals, I can feel them. They're alive." I looked at my son and saw his eyes were glowing slightly purple. He held out his hands toward the crystals growing on our RV, and somehow, impossibly, they started shrinking back. Outside, Betsy was throwing her flares at the crawlers. The bright red light made them screech and retreat into the ground. But there were too many. They were coming from everywhere now. "Drive, Dad," Michael shouted. "I'll keep the crystals away." I slammed the gas pedal. The winch cable snapped with a loud bang, but we were free enough now. The RV's tires finally found grip, and we started moving. In the rearview mirror, I saw Betsy surrounded by crawlers. She was holding up her last flare, smiling at us. Then the ground opened up beneath her. The last thing I heard her yell was, "Get to the old church! The bell tower! They can't!" But her voice was cut off as the ground swallowed her whole. I sped through the dark streets, trying to remember where I'd seen the church earlier. Michael sat next to me, his hands stretched out, somehow keeping the crystals from growing on our RV. But I could see it was wearing him out. "Hang on, buddy," I said, taking a sharp turn. The RV's headlights caught something ahead, the old church's bell tower, rising up against the dark sky. But getting there wasn't going to be easy. The road was breaking apart, with crawlers bursting out everywhere. They were taller than humans, their bodies bending in ways that weren't natural. Every time they touched the ground, more crystals grew. "Dad, I can't." Michael's voice was weak. "I can't hold them back much longer." The RV shuddered as crystals started growing on the wheels again. Through the windows, I could see the crawlers getting closer. They moved so fast, like shadows with too many limbs. Then I remembered something, the mining equipment in the back. "Michael, the emergency floodlights, like Betsy's flares." Michael understood. He crawled to the back and found our powerful work lights. As soon as he switched them on, pointing them out the windows, the crawlers shrieked and backed away. The church was just ahead now, but the ground in front of it was like a sea of crystals. They were growing higher and higher, trying to block our path. I could hear the RV's metal frame groaning as more crystals tried to climb up our sides. "The bell tower," Michael said suddenly. "Dad, I can hear it, singing. Like the crystals, but different. It's trying to help us." He was right. The old church bell was vibrating, making a deep sound that seemed to push the crystals back. It was our only chance. I pressed the gas pedal all the way down. "Hold on!" I yelled, as we charged toward the church steps. The RV hit the crystal barrier with a huge crash, but we broke through. But we weren't safe yet. Not even close. Because as we reached the church doors, I saw something that made my heart stop. The biggest crawler of all, rising up from behind the bell tower. And it was changing, growing, its body becoming covered in the same crystals that had tried to trap us. We crashed through the old church doors, the RV's headlights lighting up the dusty inside. The giant crawler was right behind us, its crystal-covered body scraping against the bell tower. "The basement!" Michael shouted, pointing to an open door. "Dad, there's something down there. I can feel it." I didn't want to go underground. That seemed like the worst idea with these creatures around. But we had no choice. The church walls were already starting to crack as more crawlers pushed through them. We grabbed our emergency bags and the floodlights. Just as we reached the basement stairs, I heard our RV's windows shatter. The crystals were taking it over completely. The basement was huge, bigger than it should have been. Our lights showed old mining equipment scattered around. This must have been connected to the mines somehow. But there was something else too. On the walls were drawings, ancient ones, glowing faintly in the dark. "Look," Michael whispered, touching one of the drawings. "They're showing how to stop them." The drawings showed the church bell, but underground, in some kind of big cave. And there were symbols around it, the same ones we'd seen on those first rocks Michael found. Suddenly, the ceiling above us cracked. Dirt and crystals started falling as the giant crawler tried to break through. "The tunnel?" I pointed to an old mine entrance in the corner. "We need to find that underground bell." We ran into the tunnel, just as the basement ceiling collapsed. The giant crawler's arms reached for us, but couldn't fit through the tunnel entrance. But we could hear them behind us, breaking through the rock, getting closer. Our lights were getting dimmer, the batteries were dying. And Michael? Michael was starting to glow purple like the crystals. "Dad," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "I know where to go. I can hear it calling." I didn't like how he sounded, but what choice did we have? We were deep underground now, with those things right behind us, and only my son's strange new connection to guide us. The tunnel ahead opened into a huge cave, and there it was, an ancient bell, half buried in crystal. But something was wrong. The giant crawler had somehow gotten ahead of us, and it was changing again, becoming something even worse. The giant crawler had wrapped itself around the ancient bell, its crystal-covered body glowing brighter than ever. The cave walls sparkled with thousands of crystals, all pulsing like heartbeats. "Dad?" Michael's voice shook. "It's trying to take the bell's power, if it does that." He didn't need to finish. I could feel it. The whole mountain was vibrating. More crawlers were coming through the walls surrounding us. Our last floodlight flickered and died. But then, something amazing happened. Michael stepped forward, and all the crystals in the cave glowed brighter. Even the ones on the crawlers seemed to respond to him. "I understand now," he said. "The crystals aren't their power. They're their prison. The bell was made to keep them trapped, but they're breaking free." The giant crawler screeched, a sound that made my ears hurt. It reached for Michael with its long, crystal-covered arms. "No." I pulled out my mining equipment, finding my old gas detector. It was begging red. The cave was full of methane gas, and that gave me an idea. "Michael," I shouted. "The crystals, can you make them move?" He nodded, his eyes glowing brighter. "I think so." "Then push them toward the bell, all of them." Michael raised his hands, and something incredible happened. All the loose crystals in the cave started floating, pulled toward the bell. The crawlers screamed as the crystals on their bodies were torn away. I grabbed my emergency flare, the last one. "When I say now, get down and cover your ears." The giant crawler realized what we were doing. It lunged at us, but Michael was faster. With one final push, he sent all the crystals crashing into the bell. "Now!" I yelled, lighting the flare and throwing it. The explosion was huge. The methane gas caught fire, and the heat made the crystals shatter. The bell rang out, louder than anything I'd ever heard. The sound went through everything, through the rocks, through our bodies. The crawlers shrieked one last time as the bell's sound trapped them back in the crystals. The giant one fought hardest, but even it couldn't resist. One by one, they all turned into crystal statues. Then everything went quiet. The cave walls stopped shaking. And Michael collapsed in my arms. I carried Michael out through the tunnels, following the fresh air until we finally reached the surface. The sky was starting to get light. Morning was coming. The lunar eclipse was over. At the church, everything was different now. Our RV was completely covered in crystals, looking like some strange art piece. The whole town was quiet. No more humming, no more scratching sounds. Michael woke up as I set him down on the church steps. His eyes were back to normal, but something had changed. I could see it in the way he looked at the crystals around us. "They're sleeping now, Dad," he said quietly. The bell put them back to sleep. But he touched a nearby crystal. "I can still feel them. They're not gone, just waiting." That's when we heard vehicles approaching. Government trucks, lots of them. Men in suits and scientists started pouring into the town. One of them, an older man, walked straight to us. "Mr. Wheeler," he said, not looking surprised to see us. "We've been monitoring this area for years. What happened here last night?" Before I could answer, Michael spoke up. "You knew about them, didn't you? About the crawlers? That's why you never close these mines completely." The man looked at Michael for a long time. "You've changed," he said finally. "You're connected to them now." He was right. Even as we talked, I could see small crystals forming around Michael's feet, then disappearing again. He could control them now. They wanted to take us away for testing, but I refused. We'd seen what happens when people try to control things they don't understand. Instead, I made a deal with them. We would stay in Hollow Creek as watchers. They would pay us to monitor the mines, keep people away, and most importantly, make sure the crawlers stay asleep. Michael's new abilities made him perfect for the job. They gave us a new RV, one specially made for our work. Our old one stayed where it was, a crystal monument to that terrible night. Sometimes, late at night, Michael says he can hear them singing in their sleep, deep under the mountains. And sometimes, when the moon is just right, the crystals in our collection start to glow slightly. But as long as the old bell stays where it is, as long as we keep watch, the hollow mountains keep their secrets, and the crawlers stay in their crystal prison, dreaming of the day they might wake again. It's been 6 months since that night in Hollow Creek. Michael and I live in our new RV at the edge of town, right where we can see both the church and the mine entrance. The government folks built a high fence around the whole area, telling people it's an environmental research site. I guess that's not entirely a lie. Michael's different now, but not in a bad way. He can sense things the rest of us can't. Sometimes I'll find him sitting by our crystal-covered old RV, his hand on the crystals, like he's listening to something. He says he's checking on them, making sure they're still sleeping deep down there. We found out more about Betsy, too. Turns out she'd been protecting this town for 30 years, keeping people away when the crawlers got restless. Now that's our job. Her house is empty, but sometimes, on quiet nights, we see purple lights glowing from her windows. Michael says she's still here, in her own way, helping us keep watch. The hardest part is keeping curious people away. Everyone wants to know about the crystal-covered RV and the strange rocks. We tell them it's just mineral deposits, nothing special. Most believe us, but some don't. Those are the ones we have to watch carefully. Last week, during the new moon, we felt the ground shake a little. Michael's eyes got that purple glow, just for a second, and he said, "They're dreaming again, Dad, dreaming of coming back. But we're ready if they do." The old church bell was reinforced with special metal, and Michael practices controlling smaller crystals every day. He's getting stronger, better at it. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing, staying here. But then I remember what Betsy said about responsibility. Some secrets need keepers. And when I see Michael smile as he shows me a new trick with his crystal collection, I know we're where we need to be. Just yesterday, a new crystal formation appeared near the church. As I watched Michael make it disappear back into the ground, he turned to me and said, "You know, Dad, the crawlers aren't really evil. They're just different, lost, like they're looking for something they can't find." Maybe he's right, but for now, they'll have to keep looking in their dreams, deep under the hollow mountains. Because as long as we're here, that's where they'll stay. At least, that's what we hope. My name is Lucy Mitchell, and I never thought I'd be writing about the scariest days of my life. I'm 17, and up until last spring, my biggest worry was helping my dad with his research and keeping our old RV from breaking down in the middle of nowhere. Dad, that's Dr. Howard Mitchell to everyone else, is an anthropologist who spent his whole life studying Native American legends. Ever since Mom passed away when I was little, it's been just the two of us, traveling around in our burnt orange and cream-colored 1973 GMC Canyonlands RV. We call it the Beast because it's huge and has a mind of its own, especially when it comes to starting up on cold mornings. That spring, we were headed to the Cascade Mountains in Oregon. Dad had heard about people going missing there for the past 50 years, and he was sure it had something to do with the old stories he'd been studying. I remember rolling my eyes when he told me about it. I mean, people get lost in mountains all the time, right? We packed the Beast, with all our usual stuff, Dad's research equipment, our camping gear, and enough food to last us a month. Dad had built these cool hidden compartments all over the RV to store the artifacts we sometimes found. I always joked that we could probably smuggle a small elephant in there if we wanted to. The trouble started the day we reached a place the locals called Starvation Peak. Weird name, I know, but we were about to find out why. The beast decided to give up on us right there, making these awful grinding noises before completely dying. That's when we met George Running Bear, an elderly tribal member who seemed to appear out of nowhere. I'll never forget his first words to us. "You shouldn't be here. The long hunger is awakening." Dad got excited. He always did when locals mentioned anything mysterious. But something in George's eyes made my stomach twist. He wasn't telling us a story. He was warning us. That evening, as we set up camp near our broken-down RV, I noticed something odd. Despite it being spring with plenty of new growth around, all the animals we saw looked starved. Rabbits with bones showing through their fur, deer that looked more like walking skeletons. It didn't make any sense. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. Our normal research trip was about to turn into something straight out of a nightmare, one that would test not just our survival skills, but our understanding of time itself. I'm writing this down now because people need to know what's out there. But I should warn you, this story might make you question everything you believe about time, hunger, and the ancient things that live in our mountains. And whatever you do, if you're ever driving through the Cascades and see a burnt orange RV frozen in time, just keep driving. The next morning, I woke up feeling strange. Even though I'd just eaten dinner the night before, my stomach was growling like I hadn't eaten for days. Dad felt it too. We sat in the beast, munching on our breakfast granola bars. But the hunger just wouldn't go away. "Something's not right, Lucy," Dad said, checking his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. "I could swear we've been sitting here for hours, but it's only been 20 minutes. He was right. Time felt weird. Like when you're waiting for something and the clock seems to move super slow, except this was different. I looked at my phone, then at my watch, then at the RV's clock. None of them showed the same time. We decided to explore the area while waiting for help with our RV. Dad wanted to check out some caves he'd spotted nearby. That's when things got really creepy. Inside the first cave, we found paintings on the walls, really old ones. They showed a huge, hairy creature, taller than any human. But what scared me most were the drawings of people around it. They were all thin, like skeletons, reaching out with bony hands. "Dad," I whispered, shining my flashlight on the paintings, "these people, they're starving." Before he could answer, we heard George's voice behind us. "You've found the long hunger's home," he said quietly. I jumped so high, I nearly dropped my flashlight. How did he keep appearing like that? George told us the paintings were a warning. "Time and hunger are its weapons," he said. "It doesn't just eat your food, it eats your time." I thought he was just telling us some spooky old legend, but then I noticed our protein bars from breakfast had turned green with mold. All our food was rotting, way faster than it should. Even the fresh apples we'd bought 2 days ago looked like they'd been sitting there for months. That night, I wrote in my journal, 8:30 p.m., I'm so hungry it hurts. Dad's aged somehow, his hair looks grayer than this morning. George is performing some kind of protection ritual outside. The woods are too quiet. No bird sounds, no crickets, nothing. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of our nightmare. The real horror was still waiting for us, and it was getting closer with each passing hour. Or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. Time had become our enemy. Things got worse that night. Way worse. I was trying to sleep in my bunk in the RV when I heard something scratching outside. At first, I thought it was just tree branches in the wind, but there wasn't any wind. "Dad?" I whispered, sitting up. He was already awake, standing by the window with his flashlight off. "I see it, Lucy," he said so quietly I barely heard him. "Don't move." Through the RV window, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A massive shadow moved between the trees. It was huge, way bigger than a bear. Its eyes glowed like green fire in the darkness, and even though it was probably 100 feet away, I could feel it watching us. But the scariest part? The moment I looked at it, this horrible hunger hit me like a punch to the stomach. It felt like I hadn't eaten for weeks. My hands started shaking. and I felt so weak I could barely sit up. Then we heard George screaming. Dad grabbed his research bag in my hand. "We have to help him." But when we got outside, George was gone. All we found was his walking stick, and something that made no sense. His footprints in the dirt looked decades old, with small plants growing in them like they'd been there for years. We started finding other vehicles hidden in the woods, old cars from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. All of them looked like they'd been there forever, but some still had fresh coffee cups inside them. It was like time was all mixed up. The creature kept playing with us. It would appear for a few seconds, then vanish. Each time we saw it, we'd feel that terrible hunger, and time would go crazy. 5 minutes felt like 5 days. I watched Dad get older in front of my eyes, his hair turning grayer, wrinkles appearing on his face. I tried eating some crackers we had left, but they turned to dust in my mouth. Every piece of food we tried just disappeared, like our bodies couldn't hold on to it. That's when we found the bone totems, small towers of animal bones stacked around our RV. But these weren't normal bones. Some looked ancient, like dinosaur bones, while others seemed fresh but turned to dust when we touched them. "Lucy," Dad said, his voice shaking as he studied one of the totems, "I think I know what we're dealing with. This thing, it's not just making us hungry. It's feeding on time itself." I was about to answer when we heard it, a sound like 1,000 people gasping for air all at once. The creature was coming back, and this time, it wasn't hiding anymore. There it was, standing right in front of our RV, a 12-foot-tall monster that looked like a mix between a Bigfoot and something from my worst nightmares. Its fur was patchy and gray, like it had aged 1,000 years, and those green eyes, they seemed to stare right through me. But the worst part wasn't how it looked. Every time it took a step closer, I felt time stretch and bend around us. 1 second felt like an hour of starving. I watched in horror as the skin on my hands wrinkled and smoothed out over and over, like I was aging and getting young again. "Dad!" I screamed. But when I looked at him, he had aged at least 20 years in just a few minutes. His hair was completely white now, his face full of wrinkles. That's when we heard a familiar voice, George. He stumbled out of the darkness, but he looked ancient, like he had aged decades since we last saw him. "The photos!" he croaked. "Use the photos." I didn't understand at first, but then I remembered I had been taking pictures of those cave paintings with Dad's special research camera. George had told us earlier that the ancient symbols had power, but I thought he was just telling stories. Dad seemed to understand something I didn't. Despite barely being able to stand, he grabbed his research journal and started flipping through pages like crazy. "Lucy," he said, his voice weak but urgent. "The camera. Get the camera." The creature let out this horrible scream that seemed to slow down time itself. I saw birds frozen in mid-flight above us. A falling leaf took minutes to drop an inch. With shaking hands, I grabbed the camera from the RV. The creature started moving toward us, each step making the air feel thick like soup. Dad was drawing something in the dirt, copying symbols from his journal. "Take pictures of everything," he shouted. "The symbols, the creature, everything." I started clicking away, my finger pressing the shutter button as fast as I could. With each flash, the creature seemed to flinch. The photos coming out of our instant camera looked weird. The symbols were glowing on them. But we were running out of time, literally. Dad looked like he was about to collapse, and George was doing something that would change everything. What happened next still gives me nightmares. George stepped forward, his hands raised, chanting something in his native language. Each word seemed to make him age faster, but he kept going. The creature howled, a sound that made my teeth hurt and my head spin. "The photos, Lucy! Make a circle!" Dad yelled, his voice cracking with age. I understood what he meant. With trembling hands, I started placing the glowing photos in a circle around us, just like the symbols Dad had drawn in the dirt. The creature tried to charge at us, but it couldn't cross where the photos were. It was like the pictures created some kind of barrier. Each time it touched the barrier, there was this weird flash, and I could see other people, dozens of them, all trapped in different times, all victims of this thing. "It's weakening," George shouted, but he looked terrible, like he was giving up his own years to fight this monster. His hair was turning to dust, his skin becoming like paper. Dad was frantically flipping through his journal with shaking hands. "The creature feeds on time," he gasped, "but it can also choke on it." He started reading something from his oldest notebook, words in different languages, dates, names of people who had disappeared here. The creature screamed again, but this time it sounded afraid. Its form started shifting, like a television with bad reception. Sometimes it looked like a Bigfoot, sometimes like a skeleton, and sometimes like something I can't even describe. That's when George did something I'll never forget. He stepped outside our photo circle, walking straight toward the creature. "I give you my remaining years," he said calmly. "All of them at once." "George, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. There was this blinding flash of light. I saw George age hundreds of years in seconds, turning to dust right in front of us. But his sacrifice did something to the creature. It started writhing, like it was choking on too much food eaten too fast. Dad grabbed my hand. "Now, Lucy, the camera. Take one last picture." I raised the camera, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it. The creature looked right at me with those horrible green eyes, and I pressed the shutter button. When the final photo developed, I almost dropped it. The creature wasn't just trapped in the picture, it was being pulled into it, screaming and twisting. But something else was happening too. The photo was changing as I watched, showing the creature in different times, like 100 pictures all mixed into one. Dad grabbed the photo with hands that looked ancient now. His face had so many wrinkles, and his hair was completely white. He looked like he had aged 50 years in just one day. "Quick," he wheezed, "put it with the others." As soon as I placed that last photo in the circle, everything went crazy. Time itself seemed to snap like a rubber band. I saw flashes of all the people the creature had taken. Young, old, then young again. They were appearing and disappearing around us like ghosts. The creature made one last terrible sound, like 1,000 clocks breaking at once. Then it just collapsed in on itself, getting sucked into our circle of photos. The ground shook, and I felt this weird pull, like gravity was going sideways. When everything finally stopped, I looked around. Our RV was different, covered in rust in some places, brand new in others. The trees around us looked twisted, with some branches in spring bloom and others bare like winter. "Dad?" I turned to him, scared of what I'd see. He was alive, but he looked 30 years older than when we'd started this trip. His hands were shaking as he picked up the photos, which had turned black except for one, the last photo I took. "We did it, Lucy," he said softly. "We trapped it, but the cost." His voice trailed off as we looked around. People started appearing, the creature's victims who hadn't aged to dust. They were confused, lost. Some had been missing for decades, but for them, it felt like only days had passed. A ranger from 1983, a hiker from 1995, a camping family from 2010. The most amazing thing? Our old RV had become some kind of anchor point. One side of it exists in the present, but the other side, well, it's still catching up through different times. Nobody can move it now. Believe me, they've tried. It's like it's stuck between seconds. We stayed there for a while, helping the survivors, explaining what happened. Dad used his connections to make sure everyone got home safely, though explaining where they'd been was complicated. That was 2 years ago. Dad's still alive, but he looks like a grandfather now instead of a father. He can't go on research trips anymore, but he writes about what happened, trying to warn others. As for me, I still help him with his work, but I never take instant photos anymore, and every time I feel hungry, I check my watch, just to be sure. The creature is trapped in that last photo, which is locked away somewhere safe. But sometimes, when I drive past Starvation Peak, I swear I can feel time stretch a little. And if I listen carefully, I can hear a distant, hungry growl. The photos are the scariest part of this whole story. We tried to burn one once, just to test with one of the less important photos. Big mistake. The moment the flame touched it, time went crazy in our entire house. Mom's old clock ran backwards. The milk in our fridge turned to cheese and then back to fresh milk. And Dad aged another 5 years in just a few seconds before everything snapped back to normal. We learned that these photos are like cages. Each one holds a piece of the creature's power. The final photo, the one with the creature itself, that's the most dangerous. If anything happens to it, we think the creature might break free. Dad and I worked with some government people who'd been investigating the missing persons cases. They helped us build a special vault deep underground. Each photo is kept in its own steel box, surrounded by the same symbols we found in those caves. The final photo, the one with the creature, is in the center, sealed in concrete. But here's the creepy thing. Sometimes when the guards check the vault, they say they can hear scratching coming from inside the boxes. And anyone who stays too long near them starts feeling hungry, that same horrible hunger we felt on the mountain. The RV is still there too. It's become kind of a local legend. People take pictures of it, but the photos never come out right. It always looks different in each shot, sometimes new, sometimes ancient, sometimes barely there at all. The government put up a fence around it with warning signs, but they can't move it. It's like it's anchored to that spot, holding the last bits of twisted time in place. Dad lives with me now. On good days, he looks like a normal elderly man. But sometimes when he dreams about that night, he ages a few more hours. The doctors can't explain it. They can't explain any of it. George's family put up a memorial for him near the site. The strange thing is, the stone they used for his marker sometimes looks brand new, and other times it looks centuries old. I think somehow he's still there, still helping to keep the creature trapped. I still do research with Dad, but only from home now. We study time phenomena, trying to understand what happened to us. Sometimes I wake up at night, starving, and I have to check all my clocks and watches, just to make sure time is still moving the way it should. But you know what's the scariest part? Last week, I developed some old film I found in Dad's camera from that night. In one of the pictures, in the background, far behind the creature, there was another one, watching, waiting. Maybe that's why I'm telling you this story. Because even though we trapped one of them, I don't think it was the only one out there. So if you're ever in the mountains, and you start feeling a strange hunger, and your watch starts acting funny, run. Run as fast as you can. Because time isn't always on our side.